These are the quick and dirty narrated notes for the lecture on species distribution and a little bit of a diversion into ecology. The relevant parts of the text are listed there, but the big thing is there is a supplemental reading, the paper by Sagarin et al., and I've also put a talking points, things that we're going to be discussing in class about the paper, important points about the paper. So let's look. The geographic range of a species, it's central. It shows where organisms are in geographic space. The beautiful part about this for us in a geography department is that it can be mapped. And so if you look at this map right here, it's a hypothetical. The darkened portion is the area in which a particular species can be found. And this map shows that area. And it also shows, by definition, then, the parts of the world where that species is not found. Notice as well there is a disjunction. So there's this large distribution here, but then there's a smaller patch, a smaller separate population down here. And all of these are delimited by borders. So keep thinking along those terms. What's going to be important for us are areas and also borders. This slide is just, I don't know, quickie review for most of you. I presume that in some of your geography classes, you've had discussions of coordinate systems, the problems of presenting three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional map form. Just realize, keep that in the back of your mind as we're going on. How can we present these things? Outline maps. Here's a beautiful little butterfly that's present in the central and southern plains, and notice how it is delimited on the map here. There are lots of separate little polygons. Notice they're nice rectangles showing where this species has been identified. One could map this with a line that sort of encompasses all of these, the northernmost point, southernmost, westernmost, easternmost, and draft it like that. But this is intended to show more where the actual data are found. Contrast that with this map of the spruce beetle. And what I asked the people in class was, is there anything that you can imagine is controlling this? And of course, the clear answer is latitude, and as reflected by temperature. This is clearly a northern species. Cooler areas, it does quite well. That's a physical factor, but another factor is, look at the name. It is the spruce beetle, so clearly it needs spruce trees for part of its life cycle feeding. Here's another one, the American chestnut, and here you could say that its range is noted by its presence in the Appalachian Mountains, but there's also a lot of coastal plain occurrences in the sort of northernmost part of the range. Look at all of the little isolated populations around, especially this southern, southeastern half of the distribution. And you could imagine, are those places where new populations have sort of sprung forth and the range is expanding? So sort of having a source population in the mountains and then smaller populations that are growing? Or is this a remnant of a much larger range for this species? And these are sort of last gasp populations on their way to local extinction or extirpation. Things to think about. Other types of maps, we have dot maps. And in this is the one species of ragweed, of ambrosia. And notice here that the author has both voucher specimens and sightings. Sightings are marked by X's, where there's actual physical data. We found it here. Vouchers are the term that we use typically for data that's been collected by someone else and deposited either in a museum or a state survey or some official entity. And then, of course, you can have hybrid maps that have both dots of occurrences or vouchers, and then an outline of some sort of idea of range. These maps can occur on many different scales, and here's a beautiful little plant, the Clematis fremonti, and it's noted because it's one of the things that has had a couple of people study it in great detail over many years locally in Missouri. And so here you see multiple ranges of this thing. There is the state of Missouri and the large scale range. Notice the changing range or scale lines here. And notice that no matter what level you are at, there's a patchy distribution for this thing. Pretty interesting. We can think of these things as being controlled or being sort of parceled in space by their niche, by various environmental factors. And so for this, we've got a bunch of species of trees, and they have graphed their effective soil pH and soil moisture, where they are optimally growing. And notice that the different species are present in different environmental regimes. Another way that we can think about distribution of organisms is source and sink. Think back to that map I showed of the American chestnut. A source population is one that has favorable environmental factors such that it has high birth rates and low death rates. In the diagram here, B and D are birth rate and death rate. And notice here in the source, the birth rate is greater than the death rate. There is also, shown on this diagram, emigration and immigration. Emigration is the movement of individuals out of a source, and immigration is movement of individuals into it. So notice near the source population, the number of immigrants is much greater than immigrants. Conditions are good here. There's high birth rates, and so there are propagules or individuals streaming out of this in all directions. That's contrasted with what we call sink populations. So every one of those little outlier populations of the American chestnut, you could sort of go and test, well, what are the birth rates here? What are the death rates here? What are the rates of seed propagules coming in? Are they separate little sinks? Are they newly formed sources? And in fact, this is done all the time. Look at this sort of cartoon that shows a bunch of different sources and sinks and all the different arrows of where propagules are going. And this can change over time. And then just to pick another one, here's the same sets of populations with different occurrences or different source sink factors over two different times. These could be 2 different years, 2 different decades, bigger. Another aspect of variation in space that we look at is this, whether these organisms are arranged in a uniform fashion, a random fashion, or in a clumped or aggregated fashion. We're not going to do it, but there are interesting, unique statistical tests that can tease these apart. Just to look at a different cartoon of these things, clumped distributions, well, here are different populations of elephants in Africa. An even distribution, this is very rare in nature. It's usually something like this, a planted orchard, or random. And in fact, a lot of things obey a random distribution, like these dandelion plants in my front yard. Another aspect of range is mapping the abundance of it. So now, not just whether you have it, whether it's been seen, whether you have a voucher for it, but counting it. Abundance, how abundant. And so here's a particular species of palm tree and an east-west transect of many kilometers. Notice, look at the graph at the bottom, the axis, 0, 30, 60, 90, 120 kilometers. And then the y-axis has individuals per square kilometer. Notice it has high abundance over most of this range, and then it drops off the table. On a map, this would be one good place to draw the extent of the range, the boundary line, with a couple little isolated populations out here. Or someone else could draw a boundary line that encompasses all of them out to this area. But again, remember, this is encompassing abundance and range. The next slide is, I'll just leave it to you to sort of look at that. I'm not as worried about that one right now. Just other maps just showing different things. There can be a seasonality effect. And here's one of the locust species that is really terrorizing Africa and the Middle East right now. Their normal range is very small, but again, if conditions are exactly right, you can have a tremendous expansion of geographic range of hundreds or thousands of square kilometers. Getting to our paper, the Sagarin et al. Paper. There is a relationship between abundance and geographic range. Sagarin et al. Call it the abundance center hypothesis. The beautiful little bird that you see here is the scissor-tail flycatcher, and the map of its distribution and abundance, with greater abundance with the darkest patterns. And notice there's a quasi-bullseye pattern here with the highest abundances in the center, and it decreases outward. The Sagarin et al. Paper, which we discussed in class on Wednesday, comes up with a whole bunch of reasons why this might be so, but also looks at the pattern of how many species has this been documented for. So it's an interesting little paper that you need to read on the side, and we certainly are going to be tested on it. Small digression into the ecological hierarchy, and the lower half of this, communities, species, populations, and individuals, that's where most ecologists work. The upper half of this, from communities again to provinces, realms, biomes, the whole biosphere, this is where biogeographers or macroecologists work. And both groups can do mapping for this. So since communities is kind of right in the middle and feeds both to ecology, sort of standard ecological science, and upwards to biogeographic science, we're going to talk a little bit about communities. Communities, and if we jump one step down to species level, we have something that we can call the environmental factor for any organism, and it can be anything. They talk here about temperature, nutrient supply, it could be pH, light intensity, anything. And all of these species, any species, can have this graph with the optimum for them and the optimal range, meaning this is the range of temperatures, let's say, that this butterfly is most successful in producing offspring. Reproduction is key. And then on both sides of this, either higher temperatures or lower temperatures, there are zones of what we call physiological stress, where reproduction is still possible, existence is still possible, but at much lower abundances. And then ultimately zones of intolerance, where temperatures are either too low or too high for this species to succeed, to exist. Again, think about this in terms of drawing a line of the geographic range of this organism on a map. Now, this is just that was a two-dimensional view, but there is something called Liebig's view of the minimum, or law of the minimum. The upper picture we've seen before, that looked at two factors, soil pH and soil moisture. The figure on the bottom looks at three factors, but realize that it can be 10 factors, 20 factors, an uncountable number of factors that is sort of impossible to graph. The next batch of slides are things that I'm just going to assume are review for a lot of you, that disturbance affects these things, whether they are natural disturbances, anthropogenic disturbances, and then biotic factors, things that you should have had in some sort of ecologic class before. So I'm not going to go on and on about competition, predation, symbiosis. I'm going to assume that you've seen all this. This is a summary slide of 3 different types of symbioses. Competition, and here we have a diffuse competition of birds in the different levels of the canopy. The concept of keystone species, organisms that are central to the existence of many other species, predator-mediated coexistence, a whole bunch of things that fall into this. And again, I hope for most of you it is review. If not, just check and read in the textbook. I wanted to get to the whole idea of what is a community? Is it a superorganism where the interactions of all the different individuals and populations of different species they create a greater sum than the individual organisms themselves? We call these Clements communities. People map them. Or are communities just all the species that happen to be living together at the same time? So these lions here in the plains of Africa, the species I see in this diagram are this lion and then the grass here. Are they just both there because of their environmental optima, their environmental limiting factors? Or is there some key relationship between the grass, the organisms that eat the grass, the lion that eats the organisms that are eating the grass? We all know this is so, but again, are all of these species just here because of random effects, or do they create some larger community? It's a big philosophical discussion, and not everybody's interested in it, but it is still big in the ecological world. And so I think you should understand the distribution or the range of ideas for these things. The last few slides in this set just show different sort of, if you map the environmental distributions of different organisms and how they might overlap, is there a reality to this or not? These communities that are there just for random circumstance, they are from this person named Gleason. They're Gleasonian communities, and maybe they can be characterized as ships that pass in the night, or apartment dwellers that don't know their neighbors. And so this diagram here of the beautiful coral reef, is that an intimately tied together, interacting superorganism, the reef community? Or is this just an assortment of 100 species that all happen to be there because their environmental limiting factors overlap? Something to think about. I'm going to end there and let you look at the rest of the things on your own.